There he is. We lost you, David. Sound.
David, you're muted. You are muted, David.
Got it.
Okay.
I started getting security warnings and it booted me off the Wi-Fi.
Yeah, well, I got a little note popped up on my screen says you are now the host.
Oh boy,
So,
Yeah.
he's got.
I know.
Yeah.
Okay,
And disregard my text because I was trying to communicate between the two of you.
yes, no, that's okay. No, it just took a while to figure out the kinks. So like I said, this is our first attempt. It's going to be interesting. All right, let's try to start again. This is our first of 6 sessions, and we are discussing Carl Jung's last major work, The Undiscovered Self, which was first published in the mid to 1956, 57. It appeared initially in a Swiss monthly journal and then was published in the Atlantic Monthly here in the US in 1957, and then later in book form. I first encountered it 50 years ago in 1971 as a freshman undergraduate, taking my first class in comparative religion, and it was one of the required readings for that class. So if you read the first chapter or beyond, how many of you thought to yourself as you were reading it, oh my God, this could have been written yesterday?
Yeah.
Yeah. His observations, and some of this I'll go into in a little more detail if you're interested, but one of the things that Jung makes clear repeatedly throughout his works is his distrust of masses.
Mhm.
His focus is really on the individual, which stands to reason. When you're a psychoanalyst and you're working, one-to-one with an individual patient in the consulting room, that's really your universe and your frame of reference. But in this book, and again, towards the very end of his life, he's reflecting on what he, as a European in Switzerland, has just endured now twice through 2 world wars, and reflecting on the madness that consumed his world. And that work continued here in America with psychologists doing various and sundry experiments trying to figure out why Nazi Germany happened in the aftermath of the Second World War and the mass movements and the tensions with the Cold War. Social psychologists like Walter Mischel and Phil Zimbardo did a host of experiments trying to figure out what are the conditions under which people are willing to give up their own internal moral code and follow an external authority. So, trying to understand how could the common German soldiers who grew up in the society that gave us Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms do what they did in the concentration camps? How does that work inside somebody's head? And some very interesting books summarizing those experiments have been published. One of them by Phil Zimbardo that came out about 10 years ago called The Lucifer Effect. And he talks about his own infamous Stanford prison experiment conducted in the summer of 1971.
Oh, yeah.
And then he summarizes other research from that era. That's the first half of the book. And the second half of the book is he talks about his experience as an expert witness for the defense of soldiers, American soldiers that were court-martialed for abusing prisoners at the Abu Ghraib prison in Baghdad, Iraq. And he ties the two together. And I'm not going to say any more than that, but I think it's a fascinating read. But then I'm kind of a psych geek, so take that with a grain of salt.
Hey, can you send us a link for that?
I'm sorry?
Can you, in the chat, can you put a link for that?
Oh, Yes.
Or at least the title again, so I can look for it.
Yeah. Let's see. There we go.
What's the name of the psychiatrist or oh, you put it in there?
Yeah, I just put it
Yeah,
in
I see
chat.
it. Mhm.
Yeah, I read that when I was still practicing in Arizona. And I've been here for 8 years, so it's probably 10 to 12 years old. Anyway, so obviously this is Jung late in life, at the end of his career, reflecting on the maelstrom that engulfed Western Europe, the world. And he's writing this 10 years after the war ended. Well, let's just dive in, shall we? The first chapter is called The Plight of the Individual in Modern Society. And one of the things that he draws out here, again, as I said, is the contrast between the individual and the mass. So looking at the third paragraph in, the one that starts rational argument. And let me just read this, because this really sort of summarizes both what he observed 65 years ago and, in my humble opinion, what we are currently observing in this country right now. He says, rational argument can be conducted with some prospect of success only so long as the emotionality of a given situation does not exceed a certain critical degree. If the affective temperature rises above this level, the possibility of reasons having any effect ceases, and its place is taken by slogans and chimerical wish fantasies. Now, this is something I deal with in therapy all the time. The contrast between affect, which is psychobabble for a strong emotion, and reason, especially if you're dealing with a patient, say, who has panic disorder. Because those two things occur in very distinct different parts of the brain. Our emotional self, and if you've read Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence, he talks about this and even has a sketch of the brain. And part of it is called, the lizard brain, the rat brain, and the human brain, which is a somewhat pejorative way of saying there's primitive structures at the base of the brain, which we share in common with anything on the planet that has a brain. And then there are the parts that make human beings unique, and that's our cerebral cortex. And that's the part that we think with, that we talk with, that we reason with, particularly the frontal lobe, the part behind your forehead. The emotional part, the so-called limbic system, is in the core of the brain. If you think about, if this is the brain, and my fingers are the cortex, and this is the frontal lobe, this is the brain stem, the limbic system is inside and is totally wrapped around by the cortex. And there are some structures in here in the limbic system, notably a little almond-shaped structure called the amygdala, which sort of filters sensory input, sights, sounds, smells, and then opens up a file drawer in another structure in that part of the brain and compares what is being perceived right now with past experience. And so is what I'm experiencing now, do I open up the file drawer that's called good experiences, happy things, pleasant things? Or do I open up the file drawer that says bad things, scary things, dangerous things? And that happens like that. You're out on a hike and you suddenly hear a sound and it makes you think, well, that's either a strange motor running or it's a rattlesnake. And if the amygdala opens the drawer that says rattlesnake encounters, then, okay. So people who have those systems And that's part of the fight or flight response that, you know, kept us alive when we were hunting saber-toothed tigers. And floods the body with hormones and things that can be measured in a blood test. When that's active, this thinking part of the brain is in the back seat. It's not in the driver's seat because it's immediate reaction. So it's instinctive. It's not thought driven. And so one of the things that we do with patients that are struggling with chronic anxiety and panic disorder is try and shift the balance so that you start a cognitive process that says, okay, how likely is it that this thing you're imagining is actually going to happen? What's the probability? Like if I get in an airplane, it's going to crash and I'm going to die. So if you're dealing with somebody who's got a specific phobia, you start working through that so that gradually the thinking part of the brain, the part that we reason with, moves back into the driver's seat, and the instinctive, emotionally reactive part of the brain moves to the back seat where it belongs. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is really, he's saying this 40 years before this became a common concept. Let me read it again. If the affective or emotional temperature rises above a certain level, the possibility of reason, the part that's in the frontal lobe, having any effect ceases, and its place is taken by slogans and chimerical wish fantasies. Sound bites, memes, and you know, this is why social media is so important and powerful. That is to say, a sort of collective possession results, which rapidly develops into a psychic epidemic. Mass hysteria or mass delusion. Under these conditions, all those elements whose existence is merely tolerated as asocial under the rule of reason come to the top. Because reason's now in the backseat. It's all emotional reactivity, which is by definition non-rational. It's a totally different part of the brain. Such individuals are by no means rare curiosities to be met with only in prisons and lunatic asylums, so if we had any of those anymore. For every manifest case of insanity, there are, in my estimation, at least 10 latent cases who seldom get to the point of breaking out openly, but whose views and behavior, for all their appearance of normality, are influenced unconsciously by pathological and perverse factors. Wow, that was a mouthful. Okay. So basically he's saying people can look normal and they can be as crazy as fruitcakes. Now, and so he, let's see. Then he starts talking about, you know, statistics and the state and, you know, public policy and how it's driven toward a statistical ideal. But what I wanted to get to is the part towards the end of the chapter. He observes, let's see, it's the next to the last paragraph if you've got the book in front of you. And this is where you see Jung's bias towards the individual over the group. He says, the bigger the crowd, the more negligible the individual becomes. Okay, so once you get lost in the mass, you're no longer an individual, you sort of are carried up by the wave of the mass. But if the individual, overwhelmed by the sense of his own puniness and impotence, should feel that his life has lost its meaning, which after all is not identical with public welfare and higher standards of living, then he is already on the road to state slavery, and without knowing or wanting it, has become its proselyte. It's this constant tension. And he's talking about a little earlier, what happens when you have a mass sort of psychosis in a democratic society.
Mhm.
What happens when the voting public is sort of infected with this mass delusion? Then we're in trouble. We're in trouble. That's actually, he talks about that in the second paragraph of the chapter. In the first paragraph, he says, today, as the end of the second millennium draws near, which is interesting because he's writing it in the 1950s, right in the middle. We are again living in an age filled with apocalyptic images of universal destruction. What is the significance of that split symbolized by the Iron Curtain, which divides humanity into two halves? What will become of our civilization and of man himself if the hydrogen bombs begin to go off? Or if the spiritual and moral darkness of state absolutism should spread over Europe? Or in this point, we could say the whole world, because it wraps around the world these days. We have no reason to take this threat lightly. Everywhere in the West, there are subversive minorities who, sheltered by our humanitarianism and our sense of justice, you know, that First Amendment right, freedom of speech, hold the incendiary torches ready with nothing to stop the spread of their ideas except the critical reason of a single, fairly intelligent, mentally stable stratum of the population. Okay, so what's holding back mass insanity? He's saying, really not that much. And he's worried about it. This is, one should not overestimate the thickness of this stratum. It varies from country to country in accordance with national temperament. Also, it is regionally dependent on public education. I lost my place. On public education, and is subject to the influence of acutely disturbing factors of a political and economic nature. So he's aware of the impact of socioeconomic status and access to quality education. Taking plebiscites as a criterion, one could, on an optimistic estimate, put its upper limit at about 40% of the electorate. A rather more pessimistic view would not be unjustified either, since the gift of reason and critical reflection is not one of man's outstanding peculiarities.
I love that.
Yeah.
Leave it to Carl.
Gift of reason and critical reflection is not one of man's outstanding peculiarities. And even where it exists, it proves to be wavering and inconstant. The more so, as a rule, the bigger the political groups are. So the bigger the mass of humanity, basically he says, the dumber it gets. Because you lose that level of insight, self-understanding, critical reflection of the individual as soon as the individual gets lost in the mass, in the horde. And this is what he sees as the danger. He says in the next sentence, the mass crushes out the insight and reflection that are still possible with the individual. And this necessarily leads to doctrinaire and authoritarian tyranny if ever the constitutional state should succumb to a fit of weakness. Now I ask you, did he write this 65 years ago or day before yesterday?
I know.
I mean, it's just amazing to me.
Sad, but yeah.
Yeah, which just shows the level of insight that this guy had as he's reflecting
Mhm.
on recent past and sort of looking into a crystal ball saying, okay, now what? Now, there's a little good news in the next chapter. Fortunately, it's not all doom and gloom.
Mm.
But it does. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm missing somebody who wants to join us. There we are. Polly, are you there? You can unmute and join the discussion.
That's probably Rick.
Oh, yes.
Hey, hi, Rick.
Hi, you're still muted. Turn your mic on so you can. There we are.
Yeah.
Good
Were
morning.
you,
Rick.
Morning.
were you waiting very long? I afraid.
That's all right.
Yeah, I got so wrapped up in our discussion that I forgot to see the little pop-up at the top that said somebody's here, because there's nobody else in the room live except me. So it's just us folks via Zoom, which is not really all that unexpected. So welcome to the discussion. Where, at what point? Well, actually, you've
At no point.
yeah, because we've been having fun dissecting the very first chapter and talking about Jung's preference for the individual versus the group and the dangers of group, what Orwell called groupthink,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? Which is interesting that Orwell is writing 1984 at virtually the same time Jung is writing this,
Hmm.
early to mid 1950s. And of course, Huxley's Brave New World was written in the 1930s. So we've got various thinkers who are all sort of looking at the head and predicting the dangers of authoritarianism based on obviously recent experience.
Yeah.
And so a part of me wonders if it's been long enough since that, you know, 2-3 generations have passed. And there's a kind of naivete that we're missing the warning signs. You know, remember, I think all of us are old enough to remember the 60s series Lost in Space. And remember the robot that would go, danger, danger, robot, danger. Yeah, we don't have, you know, a friendly family robot to warn us when we're about to step on a landmine or into quicksand.
Mhm.
And we are on the brink, and we saw that on January 6th. And a sort of mass delusion has now taken over a majority of one of 2 major political parties in this country. We've never been through that before. This is uncharted territory. And it is exactly the kind of tension between the rational individual and the irrational mob or group that Jung is talking about in this chapter. It's like he looked into a crystal ball and he saw where we are right now.
There's an image of that Jung wrote about, I don't know where, but it always pops into my mind every once in a while, as ants, and ants don't have a individual brain. They just kind of follow around. So the masses don't think individually. You know, like some of the animals have individual brains, they may be in a group, but ants don't have like that. They're more instinctual.
Yeah, lower insects don't.
Yeah, so they just follow. And I think of that image often, about just not having your own individual brain, just following this one mass thing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so And I just read the section where he says, the way to protect ourselves as a large group, as a society, is if and only if there's that part of the population that resists the temptation to get lost in the mass, to be caught up in the wave, and remain apart so that you can maintain your objectivity and make a rational decision as opposed to an affective reaction. So in psychotherapy, emotional reactivity is most of the time a negative thing because we are so primed in this society. But we also know from studies of mass media that, what is it that gets nowadays clicks? It used to be, in the newspaper business, remember the phrase, if it bleeds, it leads?
Yeah.
What's going to grab people's attention? And that grabbing people's attention is an appeal to an emotional reaction. Because if it's too dry or sterile, it's boring. We don't want to read it. And so nowadays it's the same with clicks. It's not, people buying an actual printed newspaper, but it's clicking on a link to go to this story, that story. And of course, now you've got algorithms that say, oh, because you looked at this, you might like to look at that. Ad infinitum. And so down the rabbit hole you go. And people who aren't trained in critical thinking have a hard time pushing back and saying, wait a minute, where's this going? Who's feeding me this stuff? How reliable is this as a source of information? What is the bias implied? There's actually a wonderful nonprofit group called the News Literacy Project, newslit.org, which has developed educational programs for schools to help teach kids be more critical consumers of online information. And teach them how to ask the questions about where did this link come from? What is its source? Is this reliable journalism or is this somebody's BS? So I've signed up and I get their news feed regularly. It's some good stuff. And constantly debunking false information that spreads.
What's the feed, David? What's the
website? It's called the News Literacy Project. And it's the web address is newslit.org.
Newslit.org. Okay.
Yeah. So check that out at some point. Let's see, we've got about 15 minutes. I've been doing a lot of yapping. I'm going to be quiet and let you guys share, observe, reflect.
Oh, I wonder if there's another sub-theme under here in that person, an individual who's seeing all this mass effect or mass media amplification of it. If it doesn't match with their own core values or their own core self, then would it give a sense of desperation to a lot of people?
I'm not sure I'm quite following what you're saying. Do you mean the balance between I'm willing to give up my internal core values because
more like feeling pressured, like what you're seeing, what someone may be seeing out there on the media, what's happening in the world, if that doesn't at all resonate with how you are as a person, you're feeling pressured to go along with what people are saying or doing because you're being told that's what you should do. But if that doesn't resonate with yourself, your values, things that you find meaningful in life, then I'm wondering if that is one of the things for the individual that can bring out the depression or desperation among people. I mean, I'm thinking children or teenagers who are questioning all of these things anyway, but anybody really
Mhm.
finding meaning, I
Yeah.
think is what I'm talking about.
Right.
Well, I tell you, Sandy, I just had lunch yesterday with someone who, in my opinion, has gone down the rabbit hole. And it was really disturbing for me because I didn't know how to deal with it. I would just ask questions, but I didn't really drive very hard to challenge how they decided to believe this website versus that one.
Mhm.
And I don't know what to do in that case. It's difficult for me.
Mhm. Barry, the Newslit project has a helpful one-page resource. It's kind of a guide to how to talk to somebody who you think has gone down the rabbit hole and how to non-judgmentally engage with them and see if you can't help them raise some questions or think twice and a little bit more critically about whatever it is that they're trusting or believing. Because that's a very delicate dance. And sometimes all you can do is till the soil or plant the seed
Yeah.
and hope that it bears some fruit eventually. But this is exactly why this organization, it's their mission is to combat the misinformation and intentional disinformation that is so prevalent. And the internet has made it 10 times worse. I mean, it's bad enough when
Oh,
we
yeah.
splintered from, back in the 60s, at the height of Vietnam War, you had what, 3 channels?
Yes.
And we all watched Walter Cronkite.
Yes.
And that's the way it is on,
Yeah.
whatever day it was. And now you've got hundreds. And so people can self-select what feeds their, what we shrinks call confirmation bias. That is what tells me what I already believe
Yeah.
is really true. And so you don't get any challenging information. You don't get any contradictory information. And so I feel even more right in what I believe because everything I see on this channel tells me I'm right. So why should I believe anything different?
What Sandra said, it gets frustrating and depressing to some of us who are trying to deal with these other beliefs. Like Barry said, he was like trying to talk to this person, and then you're getting frustrated and more, I don't know if depressed is the word, but kind of like, what do I do? And kind of feeling down. I had a client that, a lot of my clients, I'm in LA, a lot of my clients come to LA for the industry. Oh, by the way, they didn't go on strike. So,
Oh,
yeah,
that's great.
announced late last night, it came on the news. Yeah. So they had some sanity here. Because when they had the writer's strike years ago, the whole city closed up pretty much. And she had to go back home to North or South Carolina for a wedding or something. And she came back and she said, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I moved away. I would have stayed in that belief system had I not came to Los Angeles and had other views to show me different points of view. She said it's so deep down there that I would have, my whole family, everybody, the whole city, the whole town is in this one mindset down there.
And where was this person from, Rita?
Either North or South Carolina.
Oh, okay. Yeah. For you local folks, Rita's with us because she and I are graduates of the same school in Santa Barbara and became friends through the Alumni Association. Yes, us Pacifica Jungianites.
Yeah, so I'm from I'm in the Los Angeles greater area. I mean, I'm actually in the valley, but
I just posted to the chat the News Literacy Project, newslit.org.
okay.
So if you're interested, you can take a look at that. So let me read this one last, this is the next to the last paragraph in this chapter, which again highlights this tension that Jung feels between the individual versus the group. He says, the bigger the crowd, the more negligible the individual becomes. Okay, so the larger the mass, the more you're just one drop in a huge wave. You lose your sense of self. But if the individual, overwhelmed by the sense of his own puniness and impotence, I think I read this before, and this is really what is happening today. People who are feeling threatened by changes. They literally are afraid they're going to lose their country.
Mhm.
Okay, so what negative emotion does that sort of a mindset lead to? What is that affective reaction? If I'm afraid I'm going to lose me, I'm going to lose my place in society, I'm going to lose my country, it's being overrun by foreigners. What emotion is that? Anybody?
Depression,
No.
hopelessness,
Close. More primal. What's the fundamental emotion?
It's fear.
Absolutely.
fear.
It's a fear response.
Mhm,
Okay.
mhm.
It's, I'm walking down a path and I hear a rattlesnake. My life is threatened. My safety is threatened. So what do we need so that we feel comfortable again? How do we allay that fear? We need a sense of security, right? I need somebody to tell me, don't worry, Dave, it's going to be okay. So people are drawn to that which helps them counteract their fear and gives them a sense of security. At which point they are putty in the demagogue's hand.
Right.
And that's what we're seeing. So let me go back to Jung. But if the individual, overwhelmed by the sense of his own puniness and impotence, should feel that his life has lost its meaning, which after all is not identical with public welfare and higher standards of living, then he is already on the road to state slavery, and without knowing or wanting it, has become its proselyte, which is exactly what I quoted in our class outline, is that line.
Mhm, mhm.
The man who looks only outside and quails before the big battalions has nothing with which to combat the evidence of his senses and his reason. But that is just what is happening today. We are all fascinated and overawed by statistical truths and large numbers, and are daily apprised of the nullity and futility of the individual personality. What are the trends? What do the polls say? This poll, that poll. Since it is not represented and personified by any mass organization, that is the individual, it's all mass. Conversely, those personages who strut about on the world stage and whose voices are heard far and wide seem to the uncritical public to be borne along on some mass movement or on the tide of public opinion, and for this reason are either applauded or execrated. The talking heads on the TV, on the cable news channel. Since mass suggestion plays the predominant role here, it remains a moot point whether their message is their own, for which they are personally responsible, or whether they merely function as a megaphone for collective opinion. So it's all this tension between the individual, who's the only thing that can think and think for itself, and mass-mindedness. Whether it's a tribe, a community, a county, a state, a political party, or whatever. So there's always this tension between the two. And Jung is highly suspicious based on his own personal experience and what he's observed in the world around him in the maelstrom of World War II, of that tendency towards mass-mindedness and the individual getting lost in the sea. So, there we are.
Mhm. Mhm.
I know when I was a child in history class and we'd be studying about Nazi Germany and how it arose and how that could come to be. At the time as children, we thought, well, that can't happen here. But
Yeah, right.
of course, we have had a long stretch of some freedom,
Which is-
but
Yeah,
I think actually it could happen with any you have someone who's charismatic enough who comes on the scene. It could happen with anyone like that.
oh yeah. Jung called that lack of imagination an evil. And especially in the US, we're great at demonizing the other. But we have a hard time looking at ourselves in the mirror. We have our own collective shadow. I mean, the current debate over critical race theory is but one example. Remember, again, we're all old enough to remember the Vietnam War, the horror of the My Lai massacre, the image of the little Vietnamese girl naked, burned, running away from a village being napalmed.
Yeah.
The American soldier blowing the brains out of a Vietnamese. I mean, those shocked us because in our cultural ethos, we were always the good guys. We were the heroes. We were the liberators. It was the others who did those atrocities, not us. And Jung simply points out how naive that is. We are all human beings, all capable of the same great things and horrible things. It's just a matter of varying degree. And again, this was the thrust of the kind of research that Zimbardo talks about in the Lucifer Effect book, of social psychologists trying to figure out how is it that Nazi Germany could have happened?
Right.
That whole sort of mass hysteria. I remember, and I'm going to close with this. My adoptive father was half German. He's the one who raised me. It's the reason I studied German in high school and college. His mother was a World War I war bride. She married an American soldier. Uh-oh, somebody's just joining now, an hour too late. And I remember having a conversation with her before she passed in the mid-70s saying, Grandma, help me understand how your relatives back in Germany could fall under the sway of Hitler. What made them go along with him? And her answer was very simple. He made us feel proud to be Germans again.
Yeah. Mhm.
After the humiliation of the First World War.
Yeah.
He appealed to their national pride.
Right. And there were the factors, economic, depression.
Yeah, I mean, he came to power in the midst of the Depression.
Oh, around PBS was showing repeatedly Rick Steves, The Rise of Fascism in Europe with Hitler and Mussolini. And they kept repeating it almost every week saying, people, watch this, watch this. This is what's
Wake
happening
up.
now.
Does this
Yeah,
sound
wake
familiar?
up.
Are you seeing, are you connecting the dots here, folks? Yeah. All right, well, listen, folks, thanks for tuning in. Maybe we'll have some live bodies in the room next week. Remains to be seen, but Shirley, you just joined us. Do you have, you're muted, so we can't hear you, but you tuned in just in time for us to be ending. We start at 9:30, not 10:30. So next week, but we are recording this. All of this has been recorded. So you will be able, hopefully later in the week, to be able to click on the link and watch it so everybody can keep up. So with that, it's time for me to close down. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and
Bye.
participating in this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
keep reading, and we'll see you all next week.
Okay, great.
All right.
Okay,
All the best.
Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye.